We learned today that Canadians are spending more of their income to pay down debt than ever before, at least based on the record keeping from Stats Canada.
The easier the financing is, in whatever way, that means that more people can afford, or more people can afford to pay more, and that will just bid the price up.
See this price tag? Do you think if the option to finance the cost of this car over time did not exist, you would be as willing to pay this much? What about this home? If it couldn't be paid for over 25 or 30 years, would you buy a home? I am willing to bet that you would likely say no for the simple reason that without debt, a car or home would not be affordable. Debt allows us to borrow to buy today and pay for it with interest in the future. It is a tool to help us purchase goods today that we can't immediately pay for.
It's not what does something cost anymore, it's can I afford the payment. And the advertising is focused on that now too, right? Big purchases are all, you can pay this weekly or bi-weekly. It's a manageable amount.
At the time of filming this documentary, Canadian household debt was at record highs, reaching almost $3 trillion. In the United States, total household debt was over $17 trillion. This inconceivable number includes mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, student debt, personal loans, installment loans, lines of credit, buy now, pay later apps, in-store credit, and payday loans. The options available to borrow today are astounding. Have you ever wondered how our reliance on credit came about? More importantly, have you wondered how the pervasive use of consumer credit to fund personal consumption has an impact on not just an individual's finances, but on the cost of goods and services for everyone? How does credit affect our overall view of what's affordable? That's what our story is about. It's not a story about our gluttony for consumer credit, and it's not about our high household debt-to-income ratio. It's a story about how we have come to view what is expensive as affordable. It's a story about how our rising use of household debt affects the price of goods, whether you are a borrower or not. It's about how we, as a society, have become DEBTASIZed.
The Farmers Market Meat Department.
Market research has paid off.
So, how are things financed? First, they've always been kind of financed, and I guess that's a little bit, what do you mean by financed? Financed in the sense that we're using long-term credit rather than paying cash. The money's coming to us differently now than it did before.
There it is! It's beautiful! Take your hat off, boy, that's a dollar bill!
Today, we are as likely to pay for something with a credit card as with cash. But how did that come about? While the concept of debt has been around since Mesopotamia, our story begins in early colonial times.
There was a cash shortages in the colonial period in America and in Canada, and book credit was the way things worked. The retailer had goods that he needed to sell, and people needed to buy them, but there wasn't a lot of cash around.
What's the total? $411, but there's a sale today. You get 10% off. That makes it $42.50.
So it's not like that financing our consumer expenditures over time is new.
This is called personal credit or consumer credit.
Buy now, pay later has always been the way people got their goods in Canada. Colonial settler households were not living independent lives. They were not self-sufficient on the farm, producing all they needed. They were already in the 1700s getting goods at general stores and using credit. Chain stores like F.W. Woolworths, they want cash only. They are not interested in credit. So it starts to diversify, I guess, the number of ways that you can buy things on cash on credit.
As early as the 18th and 19th centuries, merchant stores in small colonial towns used a form of retail store credit to help colonists buy items they needed. As retail stores grew and larger cities developed, some stores tried to return to cash-only policies. However, their customers, used to store credit, resisted the removal of such a convenient buying tool.
And any time you fellas want to pay cash, you can do as you please. But don't expect me to carry on the cup for any more groceries if you're going to mess around with a range war.
Cash is a lot easier and more efficient for a retailer to have. Things like a money-back guarantee and exchange returning your merchandise, that really requires cash. But not everybody has cash. And department stores in particular, by the turn of the century, their customers, their better customers, would like credit. Credit's being offered back as a convenience by 1900 to the best customers of the stores. So it never really goes away for all the talk about cash only. It just, again, keeps changing.
The industrial age brought an abundance of mass-produced consumer goods to market. Cash-only policies and small local store credit made larger and more frequent purchases difficult. As the Industrial Revolution increased the availability of machine-made goods, retailers and manufacturers turned to a new form of consumer credit to increase sales.
I'd say the 1850s, 1860s, middle of the 19th century, manufacturing starts to increase, and particularly there's certain kinds of expensive goods that start to be made. Harvesters, Singer sewing machines, household furniture, pianos. These are things that people can almost afford, but not quite. They need to pay over time, and that's where the installment plan starts to come. So Singer Sewing Machine Company was one of the first to develop consumer installment plans, where you could buy a more expensive product over time.
Installment loans may sound familiar, but these were not the installment plans of today. You didn't actually borrow any money. You were extended credit for an item after making a small down payment. It was actually first known as a rent-to-own program where you made monthly payments.
The whole idea that, hey, I can get this today and pay for it tomorrow, was pretty revolutionary. That's the first time you've got people thinking in a consumer culture that get it today, pay for it tomorrow. And that's a major psychological shift.
And the installment plan, let's say, starts then, but really gains momentum. By the 1920s, you could buy just about everything on an installment plan.
So, we have an industrial revolution pumping out more and more new consumer goods people wanted. And installment loans made everything easier to buy. For the retailer, offering goods on credit meant more sales.
So installment plans didn't displace the credit at the corner store, but they were an additional way to buy more expensive goods.
I was going to say, everyone's heard of the Sears Roebuck Company and their catalog, but that may not be true anymore because they've been out of business now for 20 years. And what it was a catalog that went to the rural America, and you could buy anything you want, and you would pay for it in installments. And when you actually finally paid for it, they would ship you the item.
Although installment plans from manufacturers and retailers were the beginning of mass consumption on credit, not all stores and individuals chose this route.
You didn't get to take the dining room set home and pay in installments. Some stores did. Other stores set you up with a savings account, and you had to keep putting the money in every week, and they would pay interest on it. And then when you had built up your fund to the where you could buy the set, then you got to have the set. So there were all different kinds of forms of credit that were available.
So call it layaway, call it a savings plan, whatever you want. So this doesn't involve credit of any type. The turn to all of this was when General Motors started selling you, delivering the cars in advance of your paying for them. And so now you actually are being granted credit.
Now that's what I call a good-looking car. Today, Pontiac presents a new low price 6 and an improved low price 8. And isn't that a dramatic presentation? Do you think anyone would or even could miss it? A striking overall view of the front end, showing just enough to intrigue their interest to come down and see the whole car.
Got the car out, honey?
Yeah, sweetheart, it's all tuned up, ready to go. You got your hat?
Mm-hmm.
Well then, what do you say? Let's go.
Okay.
How I love to drive my Buick with my love sitting by my side.
But saving money for a big purchase was as hard then as it is now. More importantly, to the new and growing car companies, waiting for customers to save up the full purchase price doesn't generate a lot of car sales. Enter the car loan. General Motors devised a plan to help sell their cars. They did this by creating the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, or GMAC, in 1919 to finance both dealerships and consumers at those very dealerships. Credit became a way to sell cars to the masses who couldn't afford them otherwise. And it worked. GMAC made a car more attainable because of credit, and credit helped General Motors sell more cars.
So Ford, you'd pay them for 2 or 3 years, the money would accumulate, you'd get your car. GMAC, you'd get your car after they set up the payment plan.
They're still fairly high end. You know, the advertisings are very picturesque, and the people standing by their cars are very affluent and well dressed. They're not being sold at that point in 1910, 1920 as family cars. They are really a kind of a luxury or semi-luxury good.
So the revolutionary thing here was that you were getting the item that you were trying to purchase before you'd actually paid for it. And so now there's this interest cost that's been added to it.
Our society had two ways to go here. A fork in the road, so to speak. Save money, earn interest, wait longer for larger purchases, and not incur debt. Or, for a small down payment and signing off on a payment plan that would include an added interest charge, you could take home your purchase today. As we now know, financing eventually won.
And so that started consumer credit for, I think, for the world, because there's no place else in the world that has the same sort of consumer credit that we have in North America.
What we now have is a very dramatic link between credit and consumerism. Consumer credit could help turn demand into purchases. Consumer credit meant manufacturers could increase sales and profits.
The automobile financing really didn't take off until the 50s and the 1960s.
And a shift in car advertising had an impact on that.
By the 50s, the car ads are more for family cars. The cars are bigger and sturdier and still and more modern in their styling to be appealing in that sense and desirable. But the advertising will have changed to now the family's in the picture.
It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense. Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of two fine Fords?
So they don't talk about how much the car costs or the interest rate on the loan or anything else. It's, this is what it costs. Does it fit in your paycheck? And that's the whole idea is, does it fit in your cash flow? And that's a dangerous way to be.
It really makes you wonder, how can Buick give you so much for so little?
I know, Mrs. Sherwood. I've often wondered that myself. But all you have to do is to look at the rock-bottom figures on the price tag on this big Buick two-door, six-passenger sedan.
Yeah, with the growth of the automobile industry in the 1950s and 60s, consumer finance companies were lending, but the owner of the product still was the individual household purchaser. The notion all of a sudden to develop, well, what if we leased the product to the ultimate consumer and ownership stayed with the finance company? and that was known as leasing.
Individuals would look at a lease and they'd go, well, the payment for my lease is less than if I bought a loan. Because if you get a loan, you actually have to buy the car. With the lease, you're only buying part of the car. At the end of the lease, you're guaranteeing a value.
So the leasing industry really took off in the 1960s as a different form of financing as well, and started to compete with the consumer finance lending companies.
Leasing was a way to sell higher-end vehicles to consumers for a lower monthly payment. People perceived these vehicles to be more affordable because their monthly payment was lower than through a traditional car loan. Vehicle leasing hit its peak in the 1990s. During this time, we saw a rise in the average price of new vehicle sales in Canada as lease financing increased demand for higher-cost vehicles. And the funny thing was, car prices became much less affordable during this time when you look at the purchase price relative to income. Low-cost financing, in the form of low-payment leases, drove up the sticker price of cars and increased sales of bigger, more expensive vehicles over smaller, low-cost vehicles. Leasing allowed for a lower monthly payment, but it shifted the risk of resale or residual value to the lender. As used vehicles flooded the market, prices dropped, and leasing became less attractive to lenders.
Most of the companies that used to lease cars to individuals don't anymore. So the demand has dried up. And they did that because the used car market, at least until the pandemic, became very weak because they were just flooding it with all these cars.
Beginning in the early 2000s, we once again saw car prices rise faster than incomes. To increase the perception of affordability, lenders began to extend the amount of time you could pay for a car. Instead of 3 to 5 years to pay off a car, you could extend the loan to 6 years, or now we even have the 7 and 8 year car loan.
So McDonald decided to buy a brand new Kia. She borrowed $32,000 to do it, financed over 7 years.
As of July 2023, J.D. Power reported that 58% of new vehicle loans were 84 months or longer. So, we have a cycle. Car manufacturers raise prices, auto lenders find new credit options to make the monthly payment more affordable, more people use credit to buy more and more expensive cars, car sales, car loans, and vehicle prices increase.
And for many other good reasons why people are always needing more money, more credit than they have immediately available.
Cars have become DEBTASIZed.
Well, it appears that everybody's ready. And into the spacious luggage compartment with the bags. Careful, that's Grandma's present.
We now know credit helped grow car sales and as a result increased car prices. But what about houses?
Like this one? All brick, 6 rooms, oil burner.
How have changes in how we approached mortgages over time affected home sales?
So again, we go back to the 20s and 30s. You borrowed for your house and you paid it off quickly.
The mortgages were not amortized. So they were what many people call balloon mortgages. And so what the arrangement would be, you'd borrow $2,000 maybe. And you'd be paying interest, of course, over a period, regular interest payments on that. At the end of the term of the mortgage, all you'd done was pay the interest. You hadn't paid back any of the principal of the mortgage that you borrowed. So at the end of the term, you'd still owe the same amount that you started out with.
Up into the 1930s and 40s, residential mortgages were rare and very expensive. You were required to make a hefty down payment, mortgages carried a high interest rate, and the borrower was faced with a balloon payment at the end of the term. This meant homes were unaffordable for your average Canadian.
Well, how much, Mr. Agent? A little more than you expected, wasn't it?
Half of the single-family housing in most Canadian cities in the 30s and the 40s, and certainly before then, was rental housing.
Coming out of the war, there's an extreme housing shortage. There was not a lot of home construction in the 30s. There was no construction during the 40s. And there's quite a deficit of housing. People are pretty desperate to find places to live.
You know, if we go back prior to the Second World War, the growth of homeownership in Canada was steady, but it was fairly small. We were a small country.
After World War II, there was an increased demand for housing as veterans returned home and migration to urban centers increased.
The veteran will face his biggest problems in his hometown, and it is there they must be solved.
Governments turned to legislative changes to help boost housing. By the mid-1940s, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation was formed with the desire to increase individual homeownership for Canadians. But on its own, CMHC could not build and finance enough homes to meet demand. So once again, we developed a pathway for consumer debt to fund growth.
Banks could not lend on mortgage lending at that time, so there wasn't the supply of funding for the household. So, but as that started to grow, there became more and more pressure because of the demand for mortgages started to grow. The federal government had to revisit the regulation around limiting banks' ability to lend for mortgage loans, for example.
The Canadian banks weren't allowed to lend on mortgages until 1954, which became important in the early post-war period and into the early 1950s because there was a shortage of mortgage money at that time. I mean, literally there were people looking for mortgages who couldn't get them because the money just wasn't there. The lenders were just not there. And that was well recognized by the early 1950s. So that's why the Bank Act was changed in 54 and the National Housing Act was changed at the same time.
And there's a big housing boom. The government encourages that housing boom to get the economy going, but really people want homes and need homes. So if the financing is available, there is a supply and demand go together to create the suburban housing boom.
He has a steady, skillful job and is comfortably off, but the chances are that he will not advance much beyond his present status. The mortgage on his house is on its way to being paid, and someday it undoubtedly will be.
Canada needed more housing, people wanted homes and easier access to mortgages, and with increased mortgage lending, Canada built more homes. Governments and lenders have continued to manipulate mortgage market regulations to drive home sales. But more than creating additional housing supply, increased mortgage supply also increased home prices. In 2001, for example, CMHC introduced Canada mortgage bonds that allowed approved financial institutions to pool eligible mortgages into marketable securities they could sell to investors. So now the mortgage is not only a profitable lending tool, but also a profitable investment security. The idea behind this legislation was to ensure a supply of low-cost mortgages, but the result was to hypercharge the mortgage market. And the easier it was to get a cheap mortgage, the more house we bought.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question to know to what extent changes in the mortgage arrangements and the opportunities to get mortgages and under what terms, how much that has affected the price of housing. And logically, you would think It must have. It must have had a huge impact, certainly in the long run. Because obviously, the more people that can afford to take out mortgages and buy homes, and the more they can afford to borrow in order to do that, and especially the more incentive they have to do that, then of course that's just more people bidding on homes and pushing the price up.
Despite record low interest rates from 2009 to 2021, housing became less affordable over that period. The culprit? Prices grew faster than the savings from low rates. While population growth had an impact on demand, a big reason for the price appreciation was easy access to low-cost mortgages. An easy mortgage market DEBTASIZed the housing market.
The other effect is it encourages people to buy bigger homes because the payments are low. Well, the payments are low because the interest rate is low. It's stretched out over a long period of time, longer than normal, longer than we've ever historically seen before. Oh, I've got to get a house now because this 1.49 interest rate might not hang around forever. So I got to go out and get a house. The simple law of supply and demand means if we've got a lot of people interested in buying and the supply is pretty much steady, when we increase the demand to a static supply, we're going to have a big rise in price.
If you don't already own property, you may feel like you never will. A new report from CIBC has recently found that 76% of Canadians feel home ownership could be out of reach.
The size of homes has continued to increase from the 1950s up till now, so people seem to feel that they need bigger boxes to hold all of the more things that they are able to purchase and buy. Home sizes have expanded in parallel with increases in consumer debt.
In recent times, we saw the price of housing balloon way beyond anything we had ever seen before. Ultra-low interest rates set by the Bank of Canada and easy access to mortgage credit introduced a new housing boom.
We saw people who were refinancing their homes, taking out large mortgages, who were purchasing homes, not really being too worried about the mortgage because the interest rate was lower than inflation.
Now, a warning from the National Housing Agency. Canadian households have the highest debt levels in the G7.
Debt makes things appear more affordable. When mortgages, or any form of debt, are cheap and easy to get, we perceive what we are buying is affordable because the monthly payment is low. Sales and prices go up. Housing booms clearly prove this. But of course, the opposite is true when a debt market tightens. Rising interest rates make monthly payments increase, so buyers stay on the sidelines and prices fall.
Average is way up. Average value of a house went way up, right up until February, March of 2022. When interest rates clearly took a big jump starting in March of 2022, the housing market just collapsed. Prices started to fall. Sales of houses, like unit sales, like how many houses were sold that month, has continued to fall every month to the point where in many cases it's 20-year lows, 12-year lows, 10-year lows. These are not just less than the busiest year of 2021, 2022. These are lows that haven't been seen for decades or more.
Earning a degree or buying a home? That's the choice many college and university students are having to make.
The idea of cheap student housing no longer exists. You sort of start out, you've graduated with an education, but also with some debt.
Government student loan assistance has been available in Canada in one form or another since 1939. Initial programs reached very few students. However, by the 1960s, post-war baby boomers were in their early 20s and post-secondary enrollment was on the rise.
Yes, Jack,
The vacation will soon be over, and you'll be going back to school. You and Betty and thousands of other young people will get down to work in the business of preparing yourselves for the life ahead.
In 1964, what is today called the Canada Student Loans Program was formed. A growing number of students could now take out loans from private financial institutions with payment guarantees backed by the federal government.
Next fall, Gil Ames is going to attend an Ivy League university. Ted, who took a commercial course in high school, plans to get a white-collar job like his father's.
So when I attended school, and things have changed a lot over the years, what happened was the student loan that you received would be through a bank. Now, it was government-backed, but it was a bank that was actually providing you the funds and that you would then later make the payments back to the bank. Now, one of the issues is if the bank doesn't get paid, they had the ability to send that loan back to the government so that the bank would get paid and the government would eventually be the person that you, or the entity that you owed the money to. Now, you can still obtain funding for school through a bank, but it would typically be in a personal line of credit. Often the banks are looking for a family member to co-sign on that debt. But most of what we consider to be actual student loans is going to be directly through the government at this point.
Gil Ames with his future all laid out for him. But you're Ted Eastwood, stuck in a job you'll be in all your life. Why don't you get out? What's keeping you here anyway?
There's a direct correlation between the availability of credit and the cost of items. The more expensive the item, the argument is you need credit so you can afford to buy it now. And I think at some point, probably in the 70s or 80s, definitely since 2000, the cost of university, of higher education has gotten to the point where you have to have credit to pay for it. And so the government has facilitated people being able to attend school with these loans, but they've also allowed for the costs of obtaining an education to get out of hand.
The costs of running universities and colleges are through the roof for a number of different reasons. We all know the cost of every utility has gone up. We know that property taxes have gone up. Schools are not immune to that. Well, somebody's got to effectively pay for that, and that's where student money comes in.
Once again, we see how demand for a product, in this case education, became funded by consumer debt. But what happens when you make student debt easier to acquire? The answer, demand, that is enrollment, increases. It's hard to get a handle on the total amount of student loan debt in Canada. It is estimated that roughly 60% of a full-time student's government student loan funding is provided by the federal government, with province and territories adding the remaining 40%. However, this does not account for additional loans from private lenders not tied to Canada student loans, including credit cards and student lines of credit. Regardless, we know that much of post-secondary education is funded by student loan debt. Despite the introduction of tax-sheltered RESPs in 1972, over 40% of post-secondary students finance their education with debt.
The problem is there's so many obligations on the part of a new family, a new household. You've got your first child or second child, whatever it is. Money is tight for almost everybody in that situation. So if you start the RESP right when the child is born and you regularly contribute it, the government grants and donations will be significant. The universities start advertising to families when the kids are 17 or 18 years old. It's where do you want to go for your studies? There's no direct link between what the universities are doing towards the future, looking towards that next generation of students. So I don't know that there's any substantial investment on their part on RESPs.
Anyway, my experience going to university was certainly a lot cheaper then than it is now for my son to go. At the time, wages, income were also significantly smaller, so it was a huge hurdle for me. And what I found was that between the costs of tuition and obviously books at the time, although now everything is online, housing, and just basic expenses of any human living that I needed to borrow to be able to make my way through that process, which really formed a lot of how my life started out. You sort of start out, you've graduated with an education, but also with some debt.
And just as car loans helped more people buy cars, student loan debt helped more people attend universities and colleges. And just like with car sales, more demand meant universities could increase tuition. Easier access to student loans DEBTASIzed the cost of university education, actually adding to the long-term burden of those same student borrowers.
The cost of an education in Canada has gone up significantly in the last 2 decades.
There's talk of raising tuition by 5%. Now, my assumption would be that that would be on an ongoing basis. So if we didn't think that schooling was already expensive enough, it's only going to be getting more expensive in line with everything else. So I'm going to tell you the number one problem that I see is that if you're going to struggle to pay back a student loan, it's going to be a very quick process for that struggle to begin. People don't start struggling with their student loans at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years from when they attended school. It's a much earlier start.
I know that the banks here in Canada, it was very much relationship-based lending. So if you had a good relationship with your banker, then it was easier access to money.
What collateral can you offer for this loan, Mr. Brown?
I can offer only my record and my present salary.
Back in the day, you also you were always very nice to your bankers because they held the keys to the lending. So did they know your parents, go to the same church, same clubs, same relationship, then you would get a higher chance of getting approved.
Well, Mr. Brown, we're satisfied as to your credit and income, and we're glad to make you the loan.
Modern consumer credit started out as a way to sell sewing machines, furniture, cars, clothing, and other mass-produced goods via an installment loan. By the 1970s, just about any type of credit you could imagine was available to just about anyone who wanted it because, as it turns out, giving credit is incredibly profitable.
The credit thus created is far greater in amount than all the money in the world. And this credit is the cornerstone of our world structure of commerce and industry.
But lenders learned that if you granted credit to everyone without appropriate lending policies, you will likely lose money.
But I thought banks were supposed to make loans.
They are, but we can't afford to retail money in small lots, except occasionally to accommodate a depositor.
So, lenders needed to create policies surrounding credit approvals.
Well, it's not only the time required to make a loan that we have to plan on, but also the cost of collection. You, no doubt, would like to repay your loan in small monthly installments. And as we are only permitted to charge you the regular bank rate of interest, the handling and collecting of your loan would show us a loss.
The consumer lending industry was now too large to be managed by personal relationships with your local banker.
Good place for a hardware store. Well, I think we can make you this loan.
Oh, that's fine. Will the bank need security?
No, I don't think so.
Intuitively, you and I would think that if you have a customer doesn't pay you, that's bad for business. But the actuaries have determined that you want one customer out of every 100 not to pay you, because that means you're maximizing your profit on the other 99. And so if all of your customers pay every month, your credit policies are too tight. You want to give them more credit so you can get them to buy more. Eventually, somebody's going to stop paying. That's that 1 out of 100. If you're got more than 1 out of 100 not defaulting on their payments, then your credit policies are too loose and you're losing money. Society as a whole benefits by loose credit policy because you're maximizing not only the return on the money, but you're maximizing consumption, which means you're maximizing output. Everybody's got jobs, everything, the rising tide, right, raises all boats. But when you look at individual households, the risk is anything goes wrong. There's any kind of interruption in the income stream, you're in a lot of trouble.
So then where were profits to be made? Selling things to consumers gave an opportunity for markup, but financing has really been where the biggest profits have been the last while.
For many years, credit was granted based on your lender's personal knowledge of your character, or by asking a neighbor or highly regarded person to vouch for you.
Well, that's thorny for you. He owes me a football bet for about 5 years, pays me with counterfeit money, and then gives me as a credit reference. Here, let me see it.
As consumer credit expanded during the latter half of the 19th century, retailers and credit managers needed a way to determine who was more likely to pay back a loan, so they began to collect, share, and record information on retail borrowers. Over time, the practice grew and became a big part of lending.
As the cities are getting bigger, you're not necessarily knowing who you're giving credit to anymore. So you're starting to have small local credit bureaus, and you're starting to have a discussion about if the person demands credit, how do you decide whether or not to give it to them?
Before the 1960s, thousands of small and local credit bureaus kept information about consumer credit history on paper in large filing cabinets. These early credit reports didn't include a credit score. They were just simple records of one's earnings and a borrower's ability to keep up with payments. During the 1960s, many of these local bureaus were bought up by companies wanting to create large national credit bureaus. Add to that the advance of computers in the 1960s, and many of these records could now be computerized, making recording and distribution of this information easier. Credit reporting itself was becoming an industry. Credit bureaus could collect consumer payment history information and sell this information to lenders. Eventually, the industry consolidated in Canada into two major credit bureaus, each with their own mathematical magic number. In Canada, Equifax and TransUnion are the two major players in the consumer credit reporting industry.
So, 1989, Bear Isaac Company, or corporation now, I guess, is the name of the big one. Now in Canada, they had named themselves the Beacon Score, but then they just a few years ago changed back to FICO. So it was FICO, then Beacon, and then back to FICO. But it didn't really start taking effect or gaining traction until the 90s.
Today, the credit report, and more specifically the credit score, has become another factor in our story to becoming DEBTASIZed. By the early 2000s, credit bureaus began offering credit report services directly to consumers for a monthly fee. Billed as credit monitoring and identity theft prevention, the unfortunate outcome has been that many consumers have become obsessed with chasing a perfect or better credit score.
It's one of those things where, one, the system is so complicated that most people don't even know how to read their credit reports. So we're so obsessed with that 3-digit number because it's the only thing that most consumers would understand about their credit report. The higher it is, the better. But there's about 100 different things that affect the score.
This obsession over credit scores has helped generate new ways for credit bureaus to make more money off of each consumer. But first, have you ever wondered how credit bureaus make money? How did they make money before the adoption of the credit score?
So the credit bureau makes money a lot of different ways. In the eyes of the consumer, they think they're a client or a customer of Equifax and TransUnion when they go and order, their either credit protection or buy a individual use or a monthly subscription to Equifax and TransUnion. And it is true, they are customers, but that is a very small drop in their revenue. And so Equifax and TransUnion would still do very well without ever selling a credit report to a consumer. They sell a lot more to the banks and lenders individually. They also make money by receiving updates by banks and lenders, or for a lender to be registered with Equifax and TransUnion.
Credit bureaus have been successful for many reasons. Yes, they can help the consumer qualify for credit, but largely they exist for the benefit of the lenders, and the lenders are willing to pay for it. In many cases, we consumers are also willing to pay, even if it's not cash coming out of our own pockets and given directly to Equifax and TransUnion. Costs associated with products or services, as we have seen, are usually passed down to the user.
The banks and lenders, every time you or the consumer would go and apply for any kind of loan, any kind of financing, Equifax and TransUnion would charge the individual lender for sending your personal information to the bank or lender. So they make money every time the bank checks the credit report.
Today, we see apps and credit monitoring companies that give you a free credit score in exchange for information about your spending and borrowing habits. These apps are directly responsible for today's obsession with the credit score. We look at them every day. Did my score go up? Did it go down? It's credit game madness.
If you think about Borrowell and Credit Karma or any of the other third-party apps like ClearScore is coming in big to Canada's market, they make money by essentially advertising. So the same way that Facebook makes money off of a free platform, or essentially a free platform, you're the product, which means you're getting advertised to. Anytime you click on any of their advertisements, they get a piece of that, and that's how they make money. They're in it for eyeballs. How many eyeballs can they get? How many clicks can they get? And if you buy something from that, like if you sign up for a credit card through Borrowell or Credit Karma or ClearScore, then that company would get a piece or a percentage of, a referral fee type thing.
Credit Karma's own website states that compensation may factor into how and where products appear on our platform. We generally make money when you find an offer you like and get. Yes, they try to show you credit products that are a good match for you, but the point is they are still promoting more credit.
So credit negatively impacts individuals the most. And so that's not something that people usually study or see. So the system benefits by everyone being able to spend $1 today that they haven't earned yet. But the individual who spent that $1 now has to pay somebody money to use it. So I'm not paying you back the $1 that I borrowed from you. I'm paying you back $1.10, $1.20, whatever the interest rate is. And the cumulative effect of that is we're basically mortgaging tomorrow. So all the money I'm going to make in the future, I'm going to end up paying a big chunk of it to you because I used your money today. And so we're discounting the future. So we always got to make more money. We got to get a better rate of return.
Every dime that you spend that you don't actually have the money to pay for is putting a burden on your future self, on the earnings that you'll make down the line, assuming that you make them. And this is without a doubt one of the significant things I see and have seen for 20 years, that we're counting on being able to make money 3 months from now, 2 years from now. And that isn't always true.
By having the option of credit and credit reporting systems, we are all paying more for our goods and services. Which raises the question, if you didn't have to pay so much for other things in your past, would you be borrowing for a purchase you need now? Would you have the savings? Would it be cheap enough?
Many things affect prices. So when we talk about the value of the dollar, we usually mean not the price of one article, but the prices of many articles.
You may have come to recognize a subtle theme starting to form in this story. For each type of credit that is introduced to the consumer, another similar one evolves, even if it is in a different sector. And each time, the payments tend to become smaller but extended for a longer period. Businesses and lenders are seemingly looking for a way to get you to spend more money with them and to have more of each one of your paychecks spoken for in advance. 1 for you, 2 for me, and so on. As we get closer and closer to the modern day, many businesses, especially those offering credit, are finding new and better ways to get their slice of the pie, a slice of your pay that you have not even made yet. But there is a risk factor here for them and for you.
True, but if Mr. Brown should get sick and we had no pay coming in, what would happen?
There's so many reasons that people have debt. There's so many reasons that they struggle to pay it. But yeah, it's a really good point that part of the problem is everything is costing more because it costs more. So many people are using credit cards for things, which can be fine, but credit cards inherently inflate the cost of what you're buying. There's going to be a merchant fee. There's going to be a percentage of the cost, and retailers have to build this into their pricing. So you're getting points potentially, which is nice, but everybody's paying more because of that cost.
Credit increases prices. It causes inflation. And that makes sense with basic economics, right? Supply and demand. Credit allows the people with the demand to get into the market much more sooner. So they don't have to wait till they have the money. They access using somebody else's money.
There's that bumper sticker, I owe, so off to work I go. And it keeps people working for sure.
Many retailers now are using things, systems where you supposedly don't pay any kind of a fee or an interest rate to spread your payments out over a period of time. One of the issues that this creates is you pile too many of these things on top of one another, you're not going to be able to make those payments, which is going to cause more interest eventually on the overall amount of stuff that you've purchased.
Yeah, if the person selling something knows that you're likely going to have to borrow for it, then what they're pitching you on is the cost of the payment, not the cost of the purchase. And so you're going to get that car, well, your payment's going to be $500 a month for the next 7 years. All right, as opposed to the car is being advertised for a sale price of $25,000, but because of the loan you're taking out, you're going to pay me back for $40,000. So if you knew it was going to cost you $40,000 up front, perhaps you might not buy that car.
I've often said that borrowing to spend does not increase your buying power. It simply moves it forward and destroys it later. So today you're spending more. Maybe you have more, but in the medium to long run, you'll get a lot less out of your money in the future because you've already pledged so much of it today.
The flip side, we wouldn't have the current standard of living that we have without credit. It allowed people to improve the quality of their life because they could obtain things that immediately that they used to have to wait for, or they might never be able to be obtained.
Ready, look.
And his family enjoys their standard of living.
Why is the price of a car what it is today? Well, it's because we can borrow to buy that car. If everyone had to pay cash for a car, would we all be buying $5,000 cars? I don't know, maybe. But because we can get a 5 or 6 or 8 year car loan, we can afford to finance a $50,000 car or a $100,000 pickup truck. So I think the availability of debt, the ability to borrow, definitely increases how much we can borrow, which means we can pay more for stuff.
I think you can look at just about any purchase now in consumer society that credit is propping up demand. So for example, very recently the credit card companies have started identifying purchases that you make in stores that you can now finance those purchases. So as opposed to going to the bank and getting approved for a loan or a line of credit or something like that, you can take this purchase that you made at big box store, I'm going to say Walmart, everybody knows what Walmart is, and instead of I got to pay that bill off at the end of the month, I can now designate that I want that bill to be financed over a period of time. So that's propping up demand. Nobody's got enough money right now because of inflation to buy all the things that they think that they need, but if I defer the payments over time and spread them out, it makes them more manageable. At least that's the psychology of it.
Some of these storefront retailers that only deal in like mattresses and pillows and so on, they don't actually plan necessarily to sell much of any of their inventory at retail. There's always going to be a discount. Keep this in mind. If you're shopping for a mattress, there should always be a discount on a mattress. And they are built actually to make more of their money from the financing than from the goods themselves.
Credit in and of itself isn't evil. Credit is not the bad guy in this whole story.
Credit is a tool. It's like fire. It's not evil or not evil. It's how you use it.
I think credit is responsible for the acceleration of consumerism and for the more universality of goods and services. So keeping up with the Joneses, all that sort of thing. I don't think credit was an offshoot of consumerism, and I think consumerism would have developed without it. But what credit's done is it's fertilizer. It's added fuel to the fire. It's made everything go much quicker.
So if you use fire to light a fire in your fireplace and heat your house, it's a very valuable tool. If it gets out of control, it burns your house down. So I think credit can be a useful tool if it is used wisely. The problem we have, of course, is that we use too much credit, and that's what causes problems. I am not blaming anyone for having debt, because that's the way it works.
When we spend money today that we don't have yet, is we're putting ourselves in a position where things that we can't necessarily control have to happen.
I'm a car guy, so the obvious example for me is you can get a nicer car today by signing up for a loan and credit than you could if you had to save for the 5 years to be able to buy the car that you want. Now, the trade-off is you're paying interest for those 5 years, so you're reducing your ability to buy in the future.
So there was a middle-class ideal, a middle-class image to aspire to, but I'm not sure that it ever really existed. Was it ever really affordable by the majority of people? No, it was always pitched above what the majority of people could afford.
Is there a future where we use less credit? In the short term, no, I just don't see it because our entire economy is based on debt.
We would be in trouble as a society without credit right now. So weaning ourselves off this thing would be very difficult. It's like a drug. So we're now dependent on it, we're addicted to it. People don't think of what does it cost for something, it's what's the payment. And to somehow get us all to convert back to that system where, okay, I'm looking at what the actual cost of an item is, well, if it happened overnight, we'd be in a depression. People would just stop spending money. Even if it happened over a short term, as little as 10 years, it would probably be a recession because we're just all so addicted to I gotta have it now, it doesn't matter, I'll pay for it later.
If we were to magically eliminate debt all of a sudden, there was no ability to borrow. Well, nobody could buy a car, nobody could buy a house, and I say nobody. If we eliminated debt immediately, instantly, very few people would be able to pay cash for a $50,000 car or $1 million house. We live in a society where all the forces are pushing you to debt. You want to buy a car? Debt. Want to buy a house? Debt. Want to buy a pair of shoes? Buy now, pay later. It's debt, debt, debt everywhere. So in order to escape the system, you have to first understand that you're in a system, you're in a bubble, and then you have to make the conscious decision to do everything you can to reduce your debt, eliminate it, and begin saving. It's not easy, it takes time, but it is possible. Lots of others have done it. And if you can make that conscious decision and work towards that, it is possible to escape the system where we're all debtasized.
So I'm not criticizing people for being in debt. The criticism I have is that we have allowed people or shown people and taught people that spending today and owing later is acceptable and normal, when it really shouldn't be. It's really not an ideal scenario for anyone.
Now, the younger generation, Generation Z, there's some evidence that a younger generation is looking at a smaller, simpler lifestyle. Whether that's making a virtue of necessity or a genuine change of ethos isn't 100% clear to me. If you don't have the money to spend and you have huge student debt loads and a gig economy and the declining welfare state, spending less on things may not be as much a decision as a reality. So it may be that this is entering a new phase where enjoying the sunset and the sound of the birds instead of buying things is where people become focused, but I think that remains to be seen.